Okay, again, welcome everyone. We're so excited that you guys have joined us, taking time today to join us for this first of our FAA workshops. So just so you know, this workshop series is sponsored by MnDOT's Office of Aeronautics and is administered by the Airport Technical Assistance Program, also known as AirTAP, at the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. So a little history on AirTAP. AirTAP began in 2000. It was the first of its kind in the nation, offering practical yet specialized training and resources across the state for those who operate, maintain, and administer Minnesota's public use airports. Minnesota's general aviation personnel across the state have had access to targeted information and training to reduce costs and improve the safety, quality, and the overall efficiency of airport operations. AirTAP also helps airport staff build a community network for exchanging best practices and learning from one another. So AirTAP provides 4 major service categories. We provide education and training, so we have annual events, and also technical workshops like the one we're having today. And we did do an Airports 101 series last month, excuse me. We also provide technical assistance, access to experts, and we have resources, both printed and printed materials like our website, which is a clearinghouse for info and resources. We have a quarterly newsletter, and we also have targeted guidebooks. So as I mentioned, this FAA workshop is one of 2. So today it's focusing on SOPs, change orders, and technical operations. Next Thursday is all about the environmental rules and then administering the grant process for the grant, administration of the grant life cycle. Just so you know, these both are being recorded and they will be available on our website at airtap.umn.edu. So if you are new to Zoom meeting platform, just so you know, at the bottom of your screen, you have a black bar that pops up. So you can mute yourself. This is where you unmute yourself when you want to ask a question and mute. You can show your face by starting your video. You can also see all the participants that are here. And again, here's the chat feature. So here's where you can do private and public questions and chatting amongst the participants. You can screen share here. Everyone does have that ability. Again, we're being recorded. And if you have any reactions, you can, it'll show up on your little, your icon. So today's speakers are from the FAA. We have Carl. He is going to be talking about the technical operations oversight during construction. Jake Martin, he will be talking about the change orders, and then Andy will wrap up with presenting on SOPs 10 and 11, FAA closeouts, and consultant fee analysis. So again, everyone, welcome. And again, you can ask questions in the chat, and then after each presentation, we're going to start with Carl. When he's done, we'll open the floor, and so you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. Carl, whenever you're ready. Or Andy, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I'll just introduce Carl a little bit to the group. Hey, thanks everyone for taking the time in December to get together. We miss seeing all you guys. You're doing great work out there on the airport side, getting your projects wrapped up and working with all of us in these tough times. So we appreciate the time that you've made for us today. In this ever-changing year, we've run across a lot of things, and one of the things that we came across this summer is oftentimes you see us as the face of the FAA, and we love working with all you folks, but there's many branches within the FAA. And a peer of mine, Carl Piccolo, down in Texas, he's the manager of the technical services area for the NavAids engineering group. You know, we've been in a couple conversations, and we just thought it was an optimal time to talk about how another line of business of the FAA interacts with you folks out on the airfield, and kind of find some ways to put your projects and work together to find success out there working in those fields. And so we were excited for this opportunity and excited to have the time with Carl. We did put him first because he's going to leave us here after about a half an hour, 45 minutes. He's got some other commitments. But at the end, if there's something that you had a question you didn't ask when he's there, just shoot me an email at the end of my presentation. We'll be happy to get over to Carl from there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carl, and thanks for making the time, Carl.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, again, I'm Carl Piccolo. I'm the manager of engineering services nav aids in the central service area. I have a little presentation here, and we're going to talk about technical operations responsibilities during construction. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep, it looks great, Carl.
Okay, good. Most, if not all of you, have had construction projects on your airports, and most, if not all of you, have FAA infrastructure that's on that airport, be it an instrument landing system or a PAPI, all the way to an air traffic control tower, et cetera. And you've all had projects where you're either resurfacing a runway, you're extending a runway, you're burying a new storm drain, et cetera. And most, if not all of you, have heard about a reimbursable agreement. In general, I'm the manager of engineering services nav aids in the central service area. My engineers are responsible for supporting many of these efforts, what we call reimbursable projects. I'd also like to introduce two people. Hopefully they have joined by now. Connie Beeman and Robert Kaczynski. They are managers of our NAS Planning and Integration Group, and they're responsible for setting up reimbursable agreements. Today, I'll be discussing technical operations responsibilities in detail and how COVID-19 has affected many of these efforts. All through the presentation, also, I'll be asking for your help and making us both successful whenever you have a construction project on your airport. Again, the briefing agenda, I'm going to talk about our responsibilities, the balance between the FAA and airport initiatives. I'll just kind of briefly show you the current project workload, my current project workload, and introduce you to the corporate work plan. And I'm going to share some common experiences that have occurred during some of these construction projects and show how some of them can be potentially dangerous, and show how my responsibilities helps you in your construction project avoid some of these dangerous situations. First and foremost, technical operations responsibility is we're minimizing impact to the NAS. Now you'll see that acronym NAS, that stands for National Airspace System. That's basically all of the parts and pieces that makes up the National Airspace System, from the PAPI all the way to the air traffic control tower, the center, and how they all interconnect. Our main responsibility when you have a project on your airport is to minimize that impact. That's what we call operational risk management. Our number two responsibility is ensure that construction and installation activities and product meet FAA standards. If your construction project impacts one of our facilities, for instance, you have to relocate a PAPI with your runway extension or an ILS or a Mauser, we make sure that those facilities are reinstalled per our standards and orders. Number three, we ensure environmental compliance. We provide liaison between you and all of the other organizations in the FAA, and we support targets of opportunity improvements to the NAS. Sometimes, for instance, if you a target of opportunity, if you were extending your runway and we had an old FAA VASI at that airport, instead of moving that old equipment, we would go ahead and work with the NavAids program office in Washington to supply a PAPI to upgrade that equipment. That's a good example. Our first primary responsibility, like I talked about before, is operational risk management. My engineers are primarily responsible for operational risk management when you have a construction project on an airport, and they are those orders and procedures are outlined in two orders, 6000.50 and 6000.15. We ensure that the activities do not damage our current infrastructure. We also develop mitigation plans and strategies to help avoid impact. For instance, a good example, if you're burying a fuel line all the way across your airport, you may encounter several of our facilities or our buried infrastructure. We will work on mitigation plans to make sure that when you're in close proximity to those facilities, that in the event that there was an unscheduled interruption or a damage to the facility, that we can recover quickly and continue to provide the services to the flying public. We ensure the repairs are made to FAA standards. We also are very cognizant of ROFA and RSA standards. We also help you avoid runway incursions. And later on in this presentation, I'm going to show you some common experiences where things may have gone wrong. Our second responsibility is acceptance. I talked about that. A lot of folks think this is our primary responsibility, but it is not. If your project, for instance, I'll use the same example where you're extending your runway and it displaces a PAPI, we make sure that those construction and installation activities meet our standards. And I'm going to show you in some slides that there are lots of orders and standards that we have to go by. Technical operations are just one of the things you need to remember. Technical operations, we own the NAS, we own all of those facilities, we own them and maintain them. So we're responsible for their upkeep and ensuring that they are installed per our standards so that they'll last sometimes 30 to 50 years. Here's one of the slides showing some of the just the FAA orders, directives, and standards that we go by. This is just NAVAIDS only. These are the FAA orders. And in addition, we have industry specifications that we have to go by. Again, our responsibility is to make sure that that facility can last for the next 30 or 50 years once it's installed. Some of our smaller responsibilities, number 3, we ensure environmental compliance through EDAs, NEPAs, CADEX, EOSH, and RODS. Our engineers will help with some of those activities when it's prudent. We provide liaison between the sponsor and the FAA for flight check, for publications, flight procedures, coordinating MOAs, utilities, leases, and coordinating equipment delivery, and some targets of opportunity improvements like the example that I gave you earlier. COVID-19 has really thrown a wrench into that. My ability to be able to support your efforts on site has been put on hold. We're under a nationwide FAA social distance mandate. All of our project support is on hold. All of our on-site project support is on hold with very few exceptions. We are, however, in a phased restart. Under phase 1A, we are starting projects in close proximity to where our personnel are situated. Phase 1B is we are supporting projects that will allow for some travel and overnight stays. However, both of those depend heavily on the local COVID-19 infection rates. And right now, there are very few that are below the standard of where we can go back on site and get in the field and continue to support these efforts. Some of the other factors is our employee risk factors, our project risks, and our project specifics on whether or not we can support a project or an effort on site. Most, if not all, of our efforts right now are on hold. There is a phase 2 restart that will also get started once COVID-19 levels get low enough that will allow us to work in staff facilities. One of the things that we struggle with inside engineering services is balancing the initiatives. Airport sponsors, all of you will have projects. You will get AIP grants to, for instance, extend your runway, expand your airport, et cetera. Those will generate reimbursable agreements that turn into projects for us. But at the same time, we have FAA initiatives for modernizing the national airspace system. I'll give you an example. All of the RVR systems in the NAS must be replaced by 2026. The company that built that generation of RVR is no longer going to support them. So we have secured a contract to replace them. There are hundreds of them in the central service area. So we're trying to balance airport initiatives, your projects, and supporting your projects, and still get FAA initiatives done. We do that by working with what we call the corporate work plan. It is a software suite that we use. It's basically Primavera, which is project control software that will help us manage our resources, manage schedules, manage cost, etc. Here's one of the first places I'm going to ask you for help. At the very earliest opportunity, whenever you have the first inkling that you may be engaging in a project or a construction project on your airport, either reach out to the airports division office, Andy's office, or reach out to Connie or Robert and have a discussion with them. When that gets to Connie Beeman and Robert Kaczynski, their office will enter a project into the corporate work plan. It will be a placeholder that helps reserve my resources to help support your effort. There is no distance in the future that's too far. If you think of something that's going to happen in the next 10 years, call us. We will put a placeholder in the corporate work plan, and that will get Connie and Robert's personnel in contact with you and having periodic discussions with you to see how your effort may be going and see how close it actually is to fruition. If you've hired a consultant, if you've got a design and you're wanting to go to construction in the next 90 days, it's usually too late for me to be able to support it. And I'll show you that here in just a second. This is my current workload for FY21. If you look here, this is the reimbursable projects. I've got 108 of them on my schedule now. Some of them are in various stages from design to construction and installation. The rest of these are the FAA initiatives. I have 48 people to do all of those, and I have 378 projects that are on my books. So the earlier that you can get into the corporate work plan and talk to Andy, as well as Robert and Connie, and get your project into the corporate work plan, if you can do that 3 to 5 years in advance, the odds of us being able to support it go way up. Here's some common experiences with construction on airports and where things can go wrong. Now I'm going to ask for your help again. This is an operational risk management example. You can see here, this is a contractor that's working for the airport sponsor. We were in a reimbursable agreement supporting this particular project. We had a resident engineer on site. The contractor's consultant told us that particular morning that in this particular area, they weren't going to do anything. So our resident engineer was elsewhere on the airport overseeing some activities. The contractor got ahead of himself, got on the bulldozer, started moving dirt, and impacted some of our cables. I'm going to tell you, this is the most common type of incident that occurs, and it is the most dangerous. I'll give you an example of where this can be catastrophic. The particular cables that you see in this picture here are power cables to one of our nav aids, but this could very well easily be signal cables that go to our communication sites. We've had several instances where the cutting of cables underground has caused all the transmitters in that radio transmitter and receiver site to key. It basically renders communications at that airport useless. All of the radios will heterodyne with one another, and the controllers and the pilots can't talk to one another. We have films within the FAA of where we've lost communications at an airport. We have a jumbo jet on the runway. We have another one on final approach. The controllers are frantically trying to wave off the aircraft on final approach, and they can't talk to them. Fortunately, at the last minute, that aircraft waved off and executed a go around, but you can see that 2 jumbo jets with 200 to 300 people on board with an incident on the runway can be very catastrophic. And this is the most common type of impact that we have during airport construction. So what I'm going to ask you for is, when you're in the middle of a construction project, please impress upon your consultants and your contractors that they have to contact us at every turn. When we have a reimbursable agreement in place, if you're about to start digging in the ground, make sure that our RE is there and helping make sure that you're avoiding that buried infrastructure. Here's another one down at the bottom, and this one right here just happened just a few months ago. The airport sponsors burying a storm drain. They've encountered this little structure right here. This is actually a concrete encased duct bank. It's carrying some of the same kinds of cables that you saw in the previous slide. They just kept on digging, and that duct bank almost collapsed. It would have had similar impact to this airport. Fortunately, it was avoided, and you can see that they're supporting this duct bank with this backhoe while they figure out some way to support it. Again, what I'm going to help you for is when you have a construction effort going on your airport, impress upon your consultants and your contractors to make sure that we are aware where you're digging at all times. Here's one that's an ORM and an acceptance issue and was also impacted by COVID-19. We had a reimbursable agreement that was on hold. I couldn't have my REs out there to help avoid any kind of impact to NAS facilities. And unfortunately, this particular facility got run over or damaged, knocked over. Now we've got three issues here. We've got an ORM problem because this is going to have to be rebuilt and restored. And we also have a COVID-19 issue because I can't be out there to oversee that restoration. Here's one that's called, here's an acceptance issue. This is a foundation for one of our lighted nav aids. When the contractor poured the concrete, they didn't vibrate the concrete properly. You can actually see the structural steel inside this concrete. This is not an immediate threat to the NAS. The problem is this concrete is going to fail within a number of years, and we're going to have to be out there rebuilding this foundation. Our REs will make sure that the concrete is poured per our standards, et cetera, to make sure that these facilities will last the number of years that they're intended. Here's another acceptance issue. We had an RE on site. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but the contractor is actually pulling cable through a conduit. He's got it down here. He's hooked the pull cable up to his truck and he's backing it. He's trying to pull the cable through the concrete with his truck. This is in violation of one of our standards because we have to have strain meters on that cable. All of that underground cable has strain specifications that if you exceed those specifications, it could cause the metal to fatigue. And what happens with that, we've seen it before. A few years after this is installed, we'll start having intermittent outages of the facilities that this services, and we're in there replacing it. The problem is those intermittent outages could happen at inopportune moments during IFR conditions and cause impact to the NAS. So our RE stopped them. And the second picture is he didn't have enough oomph in his pickup to pull the cable. So he used the backhoe the next day. So we stopped him, had them pull all that cable back out and re-pull it properly using the proper strain meters to make sure that the cable wasn't damaged during installation. And here's finally the last one that I have to show you. This is an RSA violation. Our engineers, our resident engineers, were not allowed to be on site because of COVID-19. Once we finally were able to see the installation, we noticed that there was an RSA violation. If our engineers, our resident engineers, were available and able to be on site, we could have avoided this problem. And as a result, this is an ALSAP installation. So dozens of boxes had to be disassembled. The bolts had to be cut and reassembled. It would have saved the sponsor quite a bit of money. Unfortunately, we weren't there to help. In a nutshell, that's our responsibilities in technical operations. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
So while we wait for maybe questions to come in the chat box, how does this apply to our airports in the Dakotas and Minnesota? And we're looking ahead. So as we get our pre-applications coming back into the ADO, we're looking ahead into projects that are in 2022 and further on out. And, technical operations, they've been a really customer facing group for us throughout the years. You've been in construction out on the airfields, and you've come into these situations, and a lot of you, through contacts of the staff you've had, you picked up the phone and found a way to get a solution. And I think the thing that we're seeing going forward with this, for all of us to be aware of, is that we don't really have that option. We've backed up the workload. They're going to have to prioritize where the efforts and their work is put, and coming back to that to get into a situation in the 12th hour with construction equipment out there is going to be very difficult. So I think the thing for all of us to keep in mind is, as we prepare for projects in fiscal year 2022, if there's areas where we're crossing elements of the NAS that's in Carl's group, we need to look at how we phase those projects. Can we push that phasing out into maybe the summer of 2022, or how can we phase those projects to make sure that they have oversight with it? Those are the kind of things that we're thinking around this topic with our group.
Yeah, and thank you, Andy, for that. And even if you don't know whether or not your effort is going to impact some of our facilities or infrastructure, give us a call. Give Andy a call. We'll engage our NAS planning and integration groups, and we'll have a conversation with you to determine whether or not we think there may be impact. If you don't know, we'll help you.
Well, if anyone has questions, you can just unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll say thank you to Carl. No one has any questions for him, so he can get on with his other responsibilities.
Okay, thanks everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to present.
And up next from our office, Jake Martin. He's currently serving a detail in our headquarters branch, or safety and standards branch, but he's still a program manager and still located in Minnesota. So we tapped Jake to talk about, 2020 has been a year of change, right? We've gone through a lot of changes, and we certainly you folks run into a lot of changes out in the construction side of things, not only construction, but other. And so change orders was a good topic for us to connect in on. We have an SOP on that. Change orders are something we deal with all the time, but part of working through the SOP is finding a fast path forward and the best path forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jake Martin, program manager from the Dakota, Minnesota ADO.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Andy. I was looking at the participant list on the screen there, and there's a lot of people I recognize, met before. There's a few names I've emailed a lot. So if we've never met, here I am. Hope we get to meet again when we're able to travel a little bit more. So this will be a brief presentation and an overview of change orders. And really, when I was building this presentation, I tried to think of the agenda in terms of what kind of questions would the sponsor and engineer be asking with why the FAA is involved. Of course, the easy answer is if it's under an FAA AIP grant, that's an easy link to make. But why specifically, other than the federal funding piece, what else are we looking at? So I wanted to take the time to explain a little bit about a change order versus a supplemental agreement, or just kind of general quantity overruns. What we are looking for and why we even care that we're looking for those things. You might have a question on, should you pre-coordinate a change order versus developing the package and sending it in as one draft package? Is approval even required? Does the FAA even need to weigh in on anything that you're proposing from a contract change under a AIP grant? And then a couple of items I wanted to share were just some best practices or examples. Here's a list of references that you can go back to if you need additional background or guidance. There's discussions of change orders and contract modifications in all of these references. Just generally remember that FAA orders are instructions to the agency based on what's contained in statute and legislation. So that's very important instructions to the FAA as far as how we're supposed to implement the program in order to comply with the laws that Congress has put in place. The SOPs are guidelines to the agency on how we're supposed to implement things. And then, of course, advisory circulars are advisory until you have a AIP grant where you're using federal money or you're a Part 139 airport, then compliance with the ACs is mandatory. We always know the minute you design a project and get a contract signed and start digging, that construction is always to plan, right? There's never an issue. Now, most of us know that there's unforeseen situations out there, Mother Nature, hidden utilities, or issues that crop up that require a change to something. Either the contractor has more effort, more materials is required than what was originally in the plan, and changes the pricing structure that goes with providing this. Of course, a good design, good planning, proper coordination can help minimize these things. And sometimes projects come in without any change orders, but they do tend to come up. And so that's why we wanted to take this time to try to highlight the importance of coordinating both between the contractor and engineer and sponsor, but also with the FAA and MnDOT. Here's a snapshot of section 535 from the handbook, which describes a lot of the background on why we're looking at change orders. Remember, there's two statutes. The one statute enacts the AIP program and governs how we administer the program and fund it. But there's a separate statute that we call 2 CFR 200, and it's very important in there, which is a total separate statute from AIP, and it governs everything in regards to procurement with federal dollars and grant programs outside of AIP. And so it very clearly lays out that change orders are considered non-competitive proposals, which means they weren't bid with the construction contract. And that anytime you have a non-competitive proposal, there needs to be a review for some specific things. So this is a very clear instruction. And from the legislation, it ties the FAA into requiring some sort of review on any contract change in regards to change orders. A quick difference between change orders and supplemental agreement. This comes from the AC 5370-10, which is the construction specifications for airport construction projects. The key terms in that paragraph are a 25% change of contract value. So that would be if you had $1 million construction project and it went up to 1.25 million. If you exceeded that because of that contract change, that would be cause for executing a supplemental agreement. Also, a scope increase or decrease would be a cause for shifting from a change order to a more formal supplemental agreement. And when we talk about scope, when the FAA talks about scope, it's more about a usable unit of work on the ground that's increasing or decreasing. So for example, let's say you're rehabilitating a 1,000 square yard apron, and a large corporate operator showed up in the time that you bid the contract to the time you were building it, because sometimes that could be a year, in the early midsummer to the next spring is when you're constructing it. And this large operator proposed building a large hangar and would maybe cause some reconfiguration on the apron that you're rehabilitating, and you might think it's the best to put the brakes on for a minute. You want to change order out some of that apron area and come back and do it at a later time. That would be a major scope decrease that we would want to make sure is captured in a supplemental agreement. Of course, there's other AIP type issues that enter that conversation about the AIP grant for the project, and those are kind of separate from the supplemental agreement conversation as it's executed, but would definitely come up as you're discussing that with your local program manager. And of course, a scope increase might be just the opposite. You bid the project to do 1,000 square yards of apron space, and for whatever reason, maybe bids came in really low and you feel like there's extra money funding and you want to add to that apron area and rehab it, and it was more of a budget limiting issue the first time around. That's another issue where we may want to execute a supplemental agreement versus a change order. And then the last key term in that paragraph is a 25% change of a major item. We look at major items like a paving project. Of course, the bituminous paving would be a major item, or concrete paving, or the P208 base course, gravel course might be a major item on a paving project. Or if it's a lighting project, the major items would be, the linear feet of lighting system installed. Anytime you're changing those items by that threshold, that would be a cause for a supplemental agreement. And the goal with shifting from a change order to a supplemental agreement, it's laid out in the advisory circular, is more about determining a renegotiation of the price between the contractor and the sponsor. And that's really, if there's suddenly much more quantity than was originally bid, that might be an opportunity to get better pricing. And similarly, if the scope went way down, the contractor may be owed additional money because his fixed costs are now spread out over a smaller amount of quantity, making the price point a little bit different for his bid. SOP 7.0 has a pretty good description of the typical 6 change orders we see. The first 3 are the most common, and the last 3 are a little less common, but I'll walk through a couple of these. Extra work's obviously the easy one. There's additional work that was not identified in the plans and specifications, and that anytime you have an extra work change order proposed, I'd refer you back to section 40-04 in the construction specifications. That talks a lot about exactly how extra work is defined. It's not necessarily additional quantity, but it might be you've reached final completion and something happened after the contractor demobilized from the site and they have to come back to the site to fix something. It wasn't a mistake or anything. It just, something else came up. And so that's a kind of an extra work case because they've already demobilized from the site. We do tend to see quantity adjustments, overruns and underruns. There's not a rule of thumb when you should, there's not a specific standard for when you should execute a change order for a quantity adjustment. I kind of put 10% out there as a rule of thumb for most projects. Bituminous paving, sometimes the tonnage isn't calculated exactly, and you might originally bid 1,000 tons of bituminous and you come in at 1,100 or 90 tons over the 1,000 or something like that. But of course, crack sealing is a common overrun that comes in 20 or 30% over sometimes because of the challenges with trying to measure the depth and the width of every single crack that's out there. So it's more of a rule of thumb. Talk about quantity adjustments with your program manager if you feel like there should be a change order executed with that. And of course, keep in mind the 25% overrun or change in quantities or major items that we discussed in the supplemental agreement. Emergency change orders, we get these from time to time. They may be AIP eligible if they're connected to the scope of what the AIP project is building. Sometimes they kind of end up in the sponsor convenience realm of things where I'll give you an example. Let's say you have an AIP grant where you're constructing an FBO building. The FBO building has water and sewer to support minimal staff operating out of that facility, and a water main serving the terminal area or the GA terminal breaks, and you need an emergency repair to restore the service. It completely makes sense from the sponsor and engineer to want to get the contractor who's already under contract to use those established bid prices via a change order to repair that utility service. And it makes sense from a practical standpoint. However, the AIP grant is limited to the F building, and we would not be able to approve that change order on the terminal due to the limitations we have on approving things outside of the scope of the grant. The other issue is if it is ineligible, proceeding with ineligible change orders are generally okay. You'd want to run that by your program manager because there is some specific concerns about additional costs to the government under grant programs when involving non-eligible work. So if it's a small issue, it's probably not a big deal, but of course, the larger the dollar size, the larger the amount of scope you're asking for an emergency change order just enters additional conversations and questions. Number 4, corrective change orders. That's usually not AIP eligible, and I'd refer you back to table C1 in item 12, and it lays out that the premise of AIP is to correctly do something one time, the first time. And so anytime there's a corrective issue, somebody built something incorrectly and needs to be demolished and say rebuilt, the grade it was paved at a grade that was slightly higher or something, or cross slopes weren't exactly per plan. That wouldn't be a change order that AIP would entertain. And that would be something, a conversation between the sponsor, the engineer, and the contractor on how to rectify that situation. Deductive change orders are potentially concerning to us if you're removing scope, primarily because of bid protest and also changing FAA specifications and standards. And the bid protest concern really enters because if you remove something, let's say you had lighting and paving in a project and you decided you wanted to remove some of the lighting scope of work, another contractor may have looked at that project and decided, well, I can't put a bid in for that project because it has lighting and I don't have the capabilities to do that. And so after the fact, after you sign the contract, you removed that lighting item. And now that contractor may look at that and say, well, had I known I didn't have to do lighting in that, I would have put in a bid, and maybe it would have changed the bid pricing. We don't know those things. Those are speculative, but anytime you remove scope, we want to look at that and understand if there's a bid protest concern. And then of course, there's no cost change orders. And the most common with these is that they extend contract time, typically due to like a grant schedule issue that came out later than anticipated. Some weather delays caused some issues, or equipment, or ordering material backlogs. In most cases, not a big deal for no cost change orders. Typically, I put a disclaimer at the bottom that it is not an assessment of any extra contract administration time for the engineer on the project, and that would be a separate assessment and a separate review. Just typically because they have a lot of those provisions in their contracts already. So we'd want to just review that separately, but those aren't typically much of a big deal. Excuse me. So this is really the meat and potatoes. Why does the FAA care? So these bullets are right out of the different languages, and I tried to tie back to where this concern comes from. So the first one is an easy one. It is what you're proposing eligible, and that ties back to that paragraph I shared earlier. And it's really, is it part of what AIP can pay for in the handbook? Because if it's not, the way the handbook and Congress has laid out the program is, if it's not in the handbook, it's not eligible. And that's just what they've laid out. So that's the first check we have to go through. The second one is justified. Why here? Why now? Is this change order critical to completing this project at this moment? Or could it wait, and could we come back at a later time when we design a more holistic project? And part of the justified conversation that's laid out in table 5-15 and the SOP in table 2-1 is, are the costs reasonable? So we make that, the FAA, are the final say in the determination on reasonable determination. However, we rely on the sponsor providing a statement to us that they provided a cost analysis and they looked at the pricing, and they may rely on an independent engineering estimate from their engineer of record on the project to say, well, here's some examples of bid prices we received on other projects in the last 12 months. And yeah, we think this cost is a reasonable cost, and the sponsor can use that to make their recommendation to us. But at the end of the day, the FAA makes the final call on if we determine those costs are reasonable. And a lot of that has to tie back to, making sure that there isn't anybody taking advantage of the situation that has happened on large projects, when there really isn't anything else anybody can do except execute the change order to get the project built. So we just want to make sure that everything's on the up and up. Buy America, we need to make a determination if any steel or manufactured goods that are in the project, if you're going to remove those or add those, if that changes whether or not the project meets the 100% domestic material provision that's in legislation, or if you already have a waiver for that project, is the additional or deletion of these materials through change order going to adjust the content percentage below the threshold where a waiver would no longer apply? If you're right at the type 3 waiver requirement of 60%, that would be a big concern. If you're somewhere in the 80s or 90s, depending on the 90 percentage range, depending on the size of that change, it might not be that big of a deal, but we definitely want to take a look at that. And I laid out a little bit of the procurement concern already. It's considered a non-competitive proposal, and we want to make sure that nobody is going to come back after the fact and file a bid protest. And so our role in addressing the procurement concern is really to look at it, look at some other examples we might have, back channels in the nationwide airport system, and tell you that, yeah, we think there's a risk here that you could have a bid protest. We strongly encourage you to take a look at this with your city attorney, assess some of these risks in the contract, and make a determination from there if you still want to proceed. So our role is really just to advise you that this could be a concern for you. And if you execute the change and you outlay these costs and pay the contractor, a bid protest could come into play after you've already outlaid the money, and we might have to determine that these costs are ineligible because of they didn't comply with some federal procurement requirements. So our role is just to advise you on the risk. A lot of times it's not that big of an issue, but on, of course, large dollar change orders where you're removing or adding large quantities of materials for some reason, it gets to be a bigger issue. Or potentially shifting construction schedules in excess of a year. If you within a 12-month window, that's pretty reasonable. But if you say, well, we're going to shift construction from summer of 2021 until summer of 2023, that could be another potential place where somebody could say, well, I didn't bid the project in 2021 because I didn't have time in my schedule, but I would have had time in my schedule in 2023 had I known. So it's a bit speculative, but our role again is just to advise you on some of the risk that goes with that. The other issue we're trying to watch out for is if you're taking AIP funds, it has to be built to FAA standards and specifications. And in table SOP 7.0, what we're looking for is, are you changing those specifications? And if you are changing them, is that acceptable under our current guidance and rules? Of course, the FAA spent a lot of money, research, and has put a lot of effort into developing the specifications. And we feel that they're the best specification to get the best product for the money that the AIP side of the house is investing in that project. So we want to make sure that that is still the case with a change order, that nothing's changed. And then the last issue we're looking at too is if it's related to a structure. Are you adding a structure? Are you changing the locations of a structure, the height or the lateral limits? Do we need to do another airspace review to determine if it represents some type of hazard to air navigation in some way? So here's kind of an example of what I sometimes get from the field out there. An airport working or a contractor working at XYZ airport needs additional compensation to account for unforeseen site conditions. They need to add additional base, and they have equipment hours to meet the paving grade. So this might be eligible, but if I get a statement like this, I can tell you right now from the figure 2-1 in the change order process that we use, I can't even enter into step 2 of the process because I don't know why the conditions were unforeseen. I don't know where this additional base is going, if it's in the scope of the grant or scope of the project or not. And I don't know how much this is going to cost to know if it's reasonable or not. And I don't know why, for one thing, you need additional base to meet the paving grade. Is the paving grade accurate? Was a paving grade designed incorrectly? There's a lot of questions that go into that statement. And so I would have to go back immediately and ask for a bunch more information on this type of a statement that we tend to get. And I think the goal is with a lot of these statements and emails is there's an effort to want to pre-coordinate and alert and try to get some feedback, and that's completely acceptable. But we also don't want to get in a position where we assess it and provide some type of eligibility determination or perceived eligibility determination. And then once the details come out in a month or 6 weeks or whatever it takes to get the package together, and that we see something that is kind of a showstopper. So we're trying to make sure we have enough detail up front to make the call instead of coming back later and having to ask for a lot of information. So really the best practice is right out of the SOP. There's 7 steps. I just covered up the first step because it's really just about managing appropriate documentation. But it's really documenting a clear and accurate description of the technical reason for the material, product, or service change. So you're telling us exactly why it has to come in, what material you're using, how the product is going to be procured, how the service is going to be performed to install it. And then you're looking at the independent estimate from the engineer and making a determination on the cost that you think is reasonable. The sponsor's doing that. Number 5 is kind of a big one. I've seen some contracts where there's kind of a percentage of cost laid out for the prime contractor. Just want any of the airport managers and city staff to know that negotiating profit is really a negotiable item in every change order. Cost plus a percentage of cost in AIP federal procurement is prohibited. So it might be okay to identify that as kind of a starting point, but just know that on every change order, you have the ability to negotiate profit for the prime contractor on a change order on every single one, depending on how complicated the change order is to administer. Of course, it's completely reasonable for the prime contractor to be compensated for the time that they have to do to reach out to their subs, negotiate that pricing, procure that equipment or that extra material you need. So it's not that it's anything bad or anything like that. It's just that it's an open negotiating tool that you should use with the contractor and the engineer to get a change order that is reasonable. And then of course the last 2 are allowing us to see that information and all that backup and providing a solid justification for the why here, why now. What's the risk of not proceeding with this change order? What are we going to gain? What are we going to lose? What's the potential ramifications? That's what we're asking in the justification statement. And so after all of this, the FAA is required to approve. We have the option of doing it at closeout or during the project. However, I'll tell you that at the closeout stage, it's at the sponsor's risk tremendously because there could be something in that closeout package that we see that violates some procurement rules or standards. And again, going back to that same bid protest example, the sponsor could have outlaid that money and now is at risk of not being reimbursed at closeout for that. So it is kind of up to the airport and the FAA to determine if the program manager on a typical project wants to review that as they go. As for me personally, I like to review them as we go because I think it's easier to get documentation that we might need from the contractor while they're still on site. If you try to resolve these issues a year later when they're busy with other projects, it gets tougher to get that type of documentation and stuff that we need to make the call. Also remember that MnDOT, they're the channeling act state with our grants. So the money flows from AIP through MnDOT to the city or the airport. And they will put change orders at 100% local cost until the FAA establishes eligibility for it. So there is potential of waiting till closeout. You might sit on unreimbursed costs for an excessive amount of time until we get it closed, while MnDOT's waiting for the FAA to weigh in on the change order eligibility. And then remember, I put this statement at the bottom of every one of the change orders I go on record with, is that this is about determining eligibility of costs under the AIP program. It's not committing additional funds for those. That is something we have to do during closeout with an amendment, and it has to be a formal amendment to the existing grant. And then we have to identify the funding source and go through that step. So we have amended grants for very large change orders that came in on a very multi-million-dollar project because something has come up, and we can do that with a formal amendment request letter before closeout. However, just know that saying a change order is eligible does not also mean you've guaranteed to get reimbursed for that from the funding side, because it's all based on funding availability at the time of closeout, whether the sponsor has the entitlements to do it or not. So that was a lot of background on what we're looking at, some technical stuff that we're trying to get at. And I wanted to leave you guys with a few examples of what are some good examples. So this is an excerpt for one of the change orders I received. I tried to highlight in red here on here what is critical about this. In this example, we've got some drainage, new drainage underneath a apron being connected to some old drainage underneath the parking lot. There was some collapse. There's some issues with the old drainage that are going to potentially cause an integrity issue with the new pavement that AIP is paying for. And so although it is a little bit outside the footprint of the project, we decided it would be a good thing to protect the AIP investment in the pavement that we're doing, to go ahead and rehab 70 feet of this, or not rehab, but a slip line 70 feet of this pavement to make sure it doesn't cause issues with the project we're trying to get done. So we felt it was connected to the project because of protecting that. And then you can see that there was a really good discussion in here about the bid prices and an estimate and how they determined that the costs were reasonable. And then at the bottom, they really laid out that there's no additional engineering fees or issues with Buy America for this particular change order. And of course, this is just an excerpt. There was all kinds of additional backup. There was the pricing with the contractor. There was a sketch clearly showing where this was on the ground, and a lot of good background information. And so this is kind of an issue we're trying to avoid here, is that, we come in and pave this, put this pavement in, and everything where that bituminous looks kind of fresh, it fails because there's some issue going on with the catch basin below the ground that might be outside the footprint. Another example that tends to come up is finding something buried below the area you are building. So in this case, concrete was buried and we needed to remove it because we were concerned about a change in the amount of the change in amount of movement during frost cycles between the soil around the concrete and the concrete itself could cause issues with the new pavement we were paving. And in this example, it's reasonable to think, it's not reasonable to think that you can take a boring at every square foot of that apron area to make sure you find everything that's buried in there. You're typically going to take 5, maybe 12 different borings in this area. You're not going to do it to the level where you might see this buried concrete. So in that example, I just wanted to show you a picture that these types of things happen. Just reach out to the ADO and try to build this package up, and we can get it reviewed and get you on your way. Another example is drainage structures that the edge drains tend to not always be known exactly where they are, especially if they were installed 20 or 30 years ago. And in this case, drainage structures were found once they were digging in the area that were going to cause issues with paving, doing some concrete paving. And they clearly laid out the options they were looking at, the merits of the options. They described why they were unforeseen, that there was some underground drainage issues that's typically hard to put on the plan unless you have some type of tracer wire on it, which you're not going to put tracing wire on your drain tile. So it was pretty clear that this was going to cause an issue with the paving operation, and not doing anything would lead to a pretty rough paving surface, or potentially much additional higher costs for the contractor to get this done in an acceptable manner, which wouldn't really help anybody. And then again, when we look at these things, what we're looking for is, okay, what's the price? What's the backup for the quote from the contractor? Exactly what are they doing with this quote? Are they missing anything? Is there additional costs that you're not thinking about with this change order? And then is there that engineer's estimate with the sponsor cost price analysis included, so we can make the determination that it's reasonable? And again, sometimes I see the engineer of record or the construction administration trying to provide that service to the airport of the reasonable or the cost price analysis. And it's okay to make the statement and talk about how you came to that, but remember, it's the sponsor who has the contractual relationship with the FAA through the grant. So the sponsor has to go on record. They can use the engineer's statement and estimates to make that determination, but they go on record to us making that determination on the cost being reasonable. So I wanted to leave enough time for some questions. Remember, we're here to help you out through the change order process, but that the ultimate decision on proceeding with a change order is between the sponsor, the engineer of record, and the contractor. And then the FAA weighs in on whether it's eligible or not. But ultimately, the sponsor has to decide if it's the right thing to do for their project to proceed with that change order. And I just wanted to leave you with the picture on the left. We encountered this during some digging I was doing down in Texas with the Army, and there was a big buried piece of rock that had a D7 dozer working on it for about 3.5, 4 hours in one day just to get a ditch dug. And these types of things happen, so we want to be responsive and try to help you get through the process. But we do have a laundry list of things we do got to get through. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
Thanks, Jake. Are you available to do D7 removal operations out there?
I think we're pretty well booked for the next 5 years, probably.
Well, I'm glad you're done playing with explosives out there and rather heavy equipment.
Yeah.
Fantastic presentation, Jake. Thank you for putting that together and appreciate the time with that. The next topic that we're going to roll into is a topic that ties in quite well with the change orders. And it's a topic that goes into this time of year for us. And for us in the ADO, our season is we're anxiously waiting for Congress to get us a new appropriation for our new program going out. For those of you that haven't caught the news, we're in a 1-week continuing resolution currently, and that's going to push us out until December 18th. We're hopeful after December 18th we get a long-term program which will support the AIP program for fiscal year 21. So the season we're in right now is mostly into closeout reports and catching up from last year. So with that, we'll go right into closeout reports, and the next topic we have through the SOPs is the consultant fee review. Both of these topics are timely as we get into the season of closing out grants and getting ready for next year's round. So today I just wanted to cover quickly the SOPs we have out there to date. Jake touched on one of them. Make sure you guys have that resource link out there for that. And do a deeper dive into the 2 most recent closeouts. So to date, hopefully all of you are using these. The first 2 that came out were construction safety and phasing plans and ALPs. That quickly came out, followed up with the Exhibit A updates. We've got guidance out there on safety risk management, CADX determinations, grant applications, which you guys all work through getting that into our office here these last 60 days. Change orders, Jake just covered. Safety area determinations are something that we look at with every project that's doing work on the runway itself, runway safety area determinations, and that's an initiative that we have with the agency right now that's going to reach out to the general aviation airports in this next few years as well. Aeronautical study coordination evaluation, and the last 2 we'll cover today are the closeout process and consultant fee analysis. So it's timely for me to talk about period of performance. Period of performance is something that really drives our closeout process. You all folks have done a great job of getting grants closed that were fiscal year 16 and older last year. Now we're looking at the fiscal year 17 grants. And really we monitor those grants and spend time on those grants before we start the process of working the new grants. So our folks right now are working through that list. They've had active meetings with you. They've had active meetings with the states. And, you know, while we look at a federal fiscal year that goes all the way to the end of September, we really only have until about June 1st, 2021 to get our closeout process done. So that clock has already started, and that's really where we're focusing in on some of our time and efforts right now. But period of performance is something that drives this for us. Period of performance came out with the 2016 grants, and it's with every grant that goes forward. So let's talk about what period of performance is. It's defined in statute, 2 CFR 200, and it's the time frame to which we have to close it out. So we're focused in on fiscal year 17 grants, but the reality is it's 4 years or 1,460 days from the date of formal acceptance. So while you might have gotten a grant in June of fiscal year 17, you'd have till June to do that. But if you got a grant later in the season, you have a little bit more time to work through that. So just defining the period of performance that we work with. We really look at timely submittals because this is a benefit to everybody, and it greatly benefits the airport sponsors. We look at getting the details needed to close this out, and documentation really should be readily available for this. As you work through a project, we get quarterly reports, we get field reports, we get daily reports. There's several meetings that go with it. But in short, we have all the documentation out there to be able to do this in a timely manner. If there's money left over at the end of the project, if we time it right and it's entitlement funds, that can be returned to the sponsor for future funding in another project. If it's not timed right, that money just expires and isn't available to the sponsor. Additionally, as Jake mentioned, through a closeout, if more money is needed, we may have recovered discretionary funding or other funding available to be used towards the project. But if we don't have the closeouts in a timely manner, we can't pay for those. We don't have a surplus of funds. It's not like there's a checking account and a slush fund sitting to the side that we have money to do this. It's simply done by closing out other grants and recovering discretionary along the way from other projects to be able to supplement this. So it's not an unlimited pot of funds, and timing is important. But all of these are benefits that we see that benefit a sponsor if we can get timely grant closeouts through the office. The FAA is shifting to everything in electronic format. All closeout documents should be sent through the state agencies to the ADO electronically. In this next year, we are implementing a new electronic data management system. Many of you folks have those in place as well. But our record keeping system of paper records is going away. And so in this era of max telework and COVID, we've had great success in the grants and getting electronic signatures and getting the grants out there, but we also need to capitalize on the success of getting the closeouts done through electronic format as well. So please send all of the closeout reports electronically going forward. Probably the greatest tool that we have out there for the sponsors is the grant closeout worksheet. We love check boxes. We love worksheets. It's a streamlined process. It allows you to compile the documentation that we need to review in an orderly manner, and it allows us to go through that documentation in an orderly manner as well. So out of the closeout SOP, this is probably the most useful tool in that SOP. Just a couple of quick tips for ensuring we do get successful closeouts. Timely field work is important. 2017 grants. Most likely some of those grants you didn't get into construction until 2018 because they came out later in the year, and that's okay. But now we've had a couple construction seasons to work through those. And so we really need to have the field work completed. As Jake mentioned, coordination of change orders ahead of the closeout process is very important. Waiting till the end to solve problems just delays that closeout and coordination process. As I mentioned before, I would emphasize the utilization of the checklist and certainly plan ahead. We're not the only agency that comes into play with reviewing these documents and coordinating them. Our channeling act states in South Dakota and Minnesota also need time to review those documents and comment as well. Bottom line is, they're not complex. This is a financial record of the project. And so as long as you can show your invoices and document the financial history, it's going to be okay. Don't be afraid of closeouts. They're not that hard to get through this standard process. I think anybody that's working out in an industry has all the ability and skill set to do those. And we're certainly here to help along the way, should you have questions or concerns. Moving on to the most recent SOP, the consultant fee analysis. Got a lot of comments or questions out there that this is a new requirement. It's not. And it's not something that just comes into play when a contract is above $100,000. Both of these requirements here are shown in the handbook and of course the advisory circular. And SOPs in general, they're not new policy or creating new procedures. They're just codifying existing guidance that we have out there in our ACs and orders. And so that's the case with this one as well. There's a myth out there that if the contract is below $100,000, you don't need to do anything. And so I've called out here in the SOP, if it's less than $100,000, you still need to have a contract comparison and work through the negotiated fees and have a memo that goes with that. If you're above $100,000, there's an independent fee analysis that is required with that. And in that case, you also need an independent fee estimator. And I call out reference to here in the slides as well. Catherine should have sent out all of our presentations in a PDF format, so you can use these to reference in the future as well. We do need some supporting documentation that comes with that. We can't just simply accept the consultant selection fee form and move forward. So some information that needs to come in the memo talks about a scoping meeting, input that went into the final scope, the preparation of the independent fee review, the submission of the fee, document when that came in, document the negotiation of and scope of the fee, the scope of the work, and of course the final negotiated fee and the record of negotiation that comes in a letter. All of this needs to come into play for projects, and we ask that you include that record of negotiation letter when you submit your application for your fiscal year 21 AIP grant. So that's a pretty quick overview to tie in two of our most recent SOPs. We'd certainly want to take the time to thank Cassandra at MnDOT and Catherine at AirTap for supporting this outreach and effort. We've got another series coming up next week that's environmental and working through a grant. So Lindsay Butler, Josh Fitzpatrick, and Sherry Lars from our group is going to be sharing some additional information from you. And we thank you for your time, and we certainly look forward to working with you folks in this next year. So with that, I'll turn it back to Catherine.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Jake, and then Carl, who was able to present today. So yeah, again, if you have any questions, we have open mic right now. If there is no questions, you have their emails, so I'm sure they'll be happy to answer them at any time. And then yes, next week we have our second presentation that you can join as well. This presentation was recorded and we will be making available on our website. So you can view it at any time and then forward it to anyone who may have missed today. On that, any last words from anyone or questions before we sign off? I hear no. So, well, it looks like you guys have some time back to your day. Again, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day today to be here today, and to the FAA for 3 wonderful presentations. So I wish everyone, hopefully I'll see most of you next week. Okay. Bye everyone.